Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 must-start players for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episodes, I'm going to be sharing my opinions and the statistics as to why I believe these upcoming running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, and even kickers are must-start players going into Week 15. Again, it is the fantasy football playoffs. It is win to stay in, and of course, get closer to winning a 2022 fantasy football championship. So we want to go ahead and give you guys a little bit more information regarding these players. Some of them I've already talked about over the course of this week, whether it was via one of my rankings videos and one of the live streams that I produced. But outside of that, we want to just give you guys more and more information regarding these players so you can set yourself up for success in order to help you get one step closer to a 2022 fantasy football championship. Now, the reason why I mention the championship so often is because that's the entire goal of this channel. If you're trying to help yourself win a championship, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, going up until Week 18 and even beyond that into the NFL playoffs, as we'll have content. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to go ahead and subscribe down below. Thank you very much. Also, as we progress throughout today's video, you see 4 silhouettes on screen. We'll mention these players, but we're also going to be mentioning some potential must-start players in the PrizePicks section of today's video, where I'll be potentially giving you guys some entries going into this weekend. Again, if you guys haven't checked them out, there's a link down in the description. When you go ahead and use promo code Andrew today to sign up and make a first-time deposit, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100 when using promo code Andrew. Also, at this current moment in time, they have a current promotion called the 12 Days of Pickmas. We're currently on day 3, and every single day at midnight, there is a new promotion that is available to the public that you can go ahead and take advantage of. Now, as of today, we have the Festive Flex Friday, where you can go ahead and put together a flex play of 6 players and go ahead and 30 times your overall entry. Go ahead and check that out today. There's a link down in the description to PrizePicks. You can use promo code Andrew today when you make that first time deposit, of course, and take advantage of the 12 days of Pickmas coming ahead. And of course, some of the entries that we're going to be talking about later today that you'll be able to take advantage of this weekend in regards to the NFL. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our must-start players for Week 15. Beginning with our number 1, it is Jacksonville Jaguars running back Travis Etienne. Now, I've heard a lot of questions in regards to Travis Etienne over the last couple of days, and I wanted to go ahead and address this first and foremost once again at even more depth. So for those of you who are struggling with the decision as to whether or not you're starting him this weekend, you'll have at least my opinion on the matter and all the statistics that I've collected this week so that you can make the best possible decision going into Week 15. So let's talk about Travis Etienne. Rightfully so, many of you are hesitant to start him. And because he's had 4 consecutive weeks in a half PPR scoring format in which he's produced less than 10 fantasy points. Now, 3 weeks ago, he took on the Baltimore Ravens. He left that game early with a foot injury. Then the following week, played against the Detroit Lions. Following week, played against the Tennessee Titans. All terrible performances across the board. And many of you are still hesitant as to whether you're starting him and asking me whether it's via the comment section, via the live streams, via DMs, Andrew, should I play Travis Etienne? Let's remember what exactly Travis Etienne contributed to our teams just not too long ago. Weeks 5 through 10, the guy was averaging 16.87 half PPR fantasy points per game throughout that 6-game span, averaging 16 rushing attempts, 97 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown per game. Of course, 3 targets, 2 catches, and 20 receiving yards per game on average over the course of that span of time. Now, with that all being the case, the unfortunate nature of fantasy football has to revolve around instant gratification or more of an idea of what have you done for me lately. There's a reason why many of us, including myself, are hesitant on guys like Jalen Waddle and or a Mike Evans going into this week. But based on the current circumstance that revolves around Travis Etienne, this offense, and the potential matchup upcoming, I believe there's a high chance for success going into the given week. Now, in the last 2 games that Travis Etienne has participated in, like I mentioned earlier, he took on the Detroit Lions, who are giving up over the course of the last 8 weeks now a 3.79 yard per carry average, one of the best in the league, and they took on the Tennessee Titans, which is in fact the best run-stopping defense in the National Football League in terms of rushing statistics allowed over the course of the last 2 months, only giving up 2.88 yards per carry on average. Obviously, very difficult matchups. And even in this last weekend's contest against the Tennessee Titans, when we were very much sure that it was going to be a difficult matchup for him, he had negative 0.24 yards before contact per rush on average. He was getting met in the backfield on a consistent basis, and obviously has to do with the fact that that defensive line of the Tennessee Titans, in comparison to the offensive line of the Jacksonville Jaguars, had a severe advantage. Now, with all that even taken into account, there was still a chance for Travis Etienne to be a 10-point running back. He had himself an opportunity on the 3-yard line to rush in, got himself 2 yards on the attempt. The following play, Trevor Lawrence, read option, keeps the ball, scores a rushing touchdown. Obviously, that is unfortunate, but in the last 2 games, still, the fact of the matter is 30 rushing attempts for Travis Etienne for only 86 rushing yards. Yet he has still played 80.47% of the offensive snaps, which means he is the primary back. He's getting ample opportunity, and it just needs a great matchup for him to explode back to being the Travis Etienne of old, the guy that was, like I mentioned, nearly averaging 17 half PPR fantasy points per game earlier this season. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this week's matchup and the variable of matchups, because again, the 11 other defenders on the opposite side of the field that are specifically there to stop Travis Etienne from scoring points in a given week. The Dallas Cowboys are giving up the 12th most points to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone. Like I've mentioned to you guys over the course of the last 15 weeks, rushing statistics is how you determine matchups. So when you look at your Yahoo app, your ESPN app, NFL.com, and they tell you it's a tough matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, don't look into that. Take the information that I'm giving you because I've done the research over multiple years. Receiving statistics do not matter. And quite frankly, Travis Etienne is not a receiving back. He's not going to get himself a high volume of receptions in a given week nonetheless. Now, when you go ahead and isolate rushing statistics, you don't want to isolate it for the entirety of the season. You want to talk about as of late, since week 7 through 14, giving you guys a spectrum of 2 months to understand as of late how well have these offenses and defenses played, because it makes a big difference, especially when we're talking about injuries and the transition of an offense being from a better team to perhaps getting worse over the course of a season. Those are all variables you have to take into account. So when I tell you it's the 12th best matchup at the position, it's not a lie. They've given up 181 rushing attempts, 771 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, and 101.1 fantasy points over the last 7 games, which is a 14.44 fantasy point per game average just off of rushing statistics alone. Per game, they're giving up 110 rushing yards, 0.57 rushing touchdowns, and a 4.26 yard per carry average, which in comparison to the most recent teams that Travis Etienne has had the privilege of taking on, is a far more advantageous matchup going into the week. In fact, when I've looked at week 7 through 14, RB1s, starting running backs up against this defense, we've seen a lot of production. Just coming back from this last week, Dameon Pierce, 78 rushing yards, a touchdown. Jonathan Taylor, week prior, 82 rushing yards. Saquon Barkley, 39 and a touchdown. Dalvin Cook, 72 rushing yards. Aaron Jones, 138 and a touchdown. A.J. Dillon in that same game, 65 rushing yards. David Montgomery, 53 on the ground. Khalil Herbert, 99 and a touchdown. Jamal Williams, 79 rushing yards. Over the course of the last 2 months here, the Dallas Cowboys have allowed 72 or more rushing yards to one singular running back every single game that they have played. Not only that, they've given up their fair share of touchdowns 2 out of the last 3 games. And even this last week, Dameon Pierce left the game early, yet still had 22 carries for 78 yards and a touchdown. Could have had even more production if, in fact, he had stayed in that game and did not leave due to the ankle injury. All taken into account, this is an advantageous matchup going into the week for Travis Etienne. I'm expecting Trevor Lawrence to be healthy, ready to go in this very competitive matchup with Evan Ingram, Zay Jones, Christian Kirk, all ready to go. It's going to stretch that defense, a secondary that is missing their number 2 cornerback, one of their starting safeties, and when there is more pressure on that secondary to make plays, perhaps they're not going to be able to stack the box as much as they usually do, which will allow Travis Etienne to run freely on this defense. Let's move on to the next player I wanted to mention, someone who took on the Dallas Cowboys most recently just last week, Chris Moore. Chris Moore is a wide receiver that I mentioned earlier this week on the waiver wire episode as someone that you might want to keep an eye on and potentially pick up going into the upcoming weeks. And again, based on the current circumstance that is currently surrounding him and all the variables, such as guys like Brandon Cooks and Nico Collins missing this week, it presents a lot of opportunity for Chris Moore. So let's talk about this. Chris Moore is coming off of a week against the Dallas Cowboys where he had 11 targets, 10 catches, 124, 0 touchdowns, but 17.4 half PPR fantasy points. Played 80% of the offensive snaps, and in this last week's game, set career highs in snaps, receptions, receiving yards, all of the above, which is incredible. Hopefully, this is going to be a jumpstart to the rest of his career and will allow him to get more opportunity within this offense. Now, with all those stats mentioned, he even had an opportunity of scoring a touchdown and making his weekend that much more of an impact. With Jeff Driscoll, with a little bit of play action, boots away, they have Chris Moore come across the formation, throws in the ball, tries to make a couple people miss. He does, gets very close to the end zone, and is quite literally marked a half a yard from scoring a touchdown on the goal line. And that was in the fourth quarter when Dak Prescott tipped pass led to an interception. Quite frankly, the Houston Texans didn't even score a touchdown on that drive. Very unfortunate scenario that very easily could have locked them up a victory if it wasn't for a half of a yard from the difference between, of course, getting Chris Moore that touchdown and helping that team win. Nonetheless, let's talk about this upcoming weekend. Specifically, let's talk about guys like Jeff Driscoll, like I just mentioned, and or Davis Mills. In the last 4 games that we have seen, Davis Mills as the starting quarterback, Chris Moore has averaged himself 10.8 half PPR fantasy points per game, while seeing an increase in targets every single subsequent game. 5, 6, 7, and 11. Those are his target increases over the course of the last 4 games with Davis Mills starting. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Brandon Cooks and Nico Collins are both going to be out in week 15, which make it even more of an impact for Chris Moore to get opportunities and, of course, follow up with fantasy points. In the last 2 games, where Nico Collins and Brandon Cooks were both out, week 14 and 9, the contributions of Chris Moore in a half PPR scoring format have been 12.5 fantasy points and 17.4. And let's not forget, Dameon Pierce is also out, which may lead to the running game for the Houston Texans not being as much of a consistent option. They'll have to continue to throw more. And if that's going to continue to be the case, I expect to see Chris Moore everywhere on this field. I mean, where he was lining up when I was watching film was ridiculous. He was lining up in the inline. He was lining up in the slot, was lining up out wide. Whether it was up against Trayvon Diggs, it did not matter. Whether it was up against Deron Bland, I mean, he was continuing to find success for the entirety of that game, making clutch catches down the sideline and playing really well. So hopefully the coaching staff and everyone within that organization, specifically the quarterback, Jeff Driscoll, who targeted him twice, that led to 2 receptions, and of course, the rest of the targets and receiving work from Davis Mills will continue to look in his direction, regardless of how they want to rotate the quarterback position there. Now, this upcoming week, they take on the Kansas City Chiefs. It is the 7th best matchup at the position in a half PPR, as they've given up 95 receptions, 1,064 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns in the last 7 games. Pretty good statistics. That's 213.9 half PPR fantasy points, which is 30.56 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So if there's potentially, 20, 30 points up for grabs for wide receivers of the Houston Texans, I'm expecting a pretty good week here from Chris Moore. I mean, if we're just looking at most recent production from wide receivers against this defense, we've seen, Christian Kirk, 27 fantasy points. We've seen Josh Palmer, 26.6 fantasy points. Jerry Jeudy, 29.3 fantasy points. And of course, Jamar Chase, 13.2 fantasy points. We've even seen secondary wide receivers like T. Higgins, 11 fantasy points. Keenan Allen, 9.9. Zay Jones, 10.8. Even Tyler Boyd, 8.0. We have seen number 2 wide receivers even find success. Even if, in fact, Chris Moore is going to be splitting touches with guys like Amari Rodgers and or a Philip Dorsett, there's still going to be enough work to get him and make him a relevant top 36 wide receiver option going into the given week based on the matchup, the opportunity, and all that's going for him in the current circumstance. That is why I believe Chris Moore is an automatic must-start play going into the week. Let's move on to the next player I wanted to mention. It is Washington Commanders running back Brian Robinson. I've mentioned Brian Robinson multiple times in the idea of him being a must-start player in other weeks, but going into this week, it's an automatic. Once again, we have to play Brian Robinson because he takes on the New York Giants. And we know over the course of the last couple weeks here, his opportunity is going up. And not only that, the efficiency of Brian Robinson is going up. Now, for those of you who are still questioning whether or not he's healthy, he was not on the injury report earlier today, despite tracking a Wednesday and Thursday limited participation. So he was cleared on Friday, got a full participation, which is great, especially considering he was coming off of the bye week. He's fully healthy, ready to go in a fantastic matchup. Now, in the last 4 games that Brian Robinson has participated in, his rushing attempts go as such: 26, 15, 18, and 21. Incredible opportunity. But in the last 2 games that we have seen him participate, he has been hyper efficient, averaging a 5.15 yard per carry average, 39 rushing attempts for 201 rushing yards. Now, while we've seen Brian Robinson step up to the rookie running back that we expected him to be coming out of Alabama, the last 2 weeks for Antonio Gibson haven't been great, having only 9 rushing attempts in each of those 2 contests. And even some of Antonio Gibson's given receiving work that he was maintaining for majority of the season, especially with J.D. McKissic hitting the IR, Brian Robinson in the last 2 games, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 35 receiving yards, and even a receiving touchdown. So if everything's beginning to trend in the direction of Brian Robinson supplanting Antonio Gibson being the full-time back, getting the majority of the touches, and of course getting opportunity down on the goal line, whether it's through the air or on the ground, this means a lot of potential for Brian Robinson Jr. going into this week's matchup against the New York Giants. It is quite literally the second best matchup going into the given week. They have given up, since week 7, 21.31 fantasy points per game on average in terms of rushing statistics alone. That's 892 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns in the last 7 games, which on a per game average is 127 rushing yards per game, 1.43 rushing touchdowns per game, and a 5.19 yard per carry average allowed to opposing running backs. Incredible statistics across the board. Now, when you go ahead and just look at the last 4 games for the New York Giants, they've allowed 8 rushing touchdowns. I'm expecting Brian Robinson to fall into the end zone, especially considering the fact that the last time he took on this defense, back in week 13, he didn't fall into the end zone, and there's a high likelihood of doing so this upcoming week. The last time we saw these two teams play, Brian Robinson accumulated 21 rushing attempts for 96 rushing yards, had himself 2 catches on 2 targets, 15 receiving yards, over 100 total all-purpose yards, 12.1 half PPR fantasy points. Going into this week, if he can accompany a touchdown with a similar set of performances, we're talking about someone that is going to be a low-end RB1 based on the matchup and the opportunity that he continues to garner within said offense. I'm expecting a huge week from Brian Robinson, and even though I'm not going to have him ranked as an RB1, that's his upside. That's what we're hoping, and he very easily can meet it. And all he needs is the trust from his coaching staff, which he has built over the course of the last month, and of course, the opportunities to deliver for us in fantasy. Now, the final thing I wanted to mention in regards to this overall matchup, most recently, we have seen guys like Miles Sanders, 144 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. Tony Pollard and Zeke combined for over 150 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Jamal Williams, 64 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. We've even seen Dameon Pierce, 94 rushing yards. Kenneth Walker, 51 and a touchdown. Travis Etienne, 114 and a touchdown. Even the week prior to that, week 6, I mean, even if we want to go all the way back, Kenyon Drake went for over 100 on this defense. Leonard Williams, questionable to potentially return going into this weekend. We know that Adoree Jackson is going to be missing, which will allow Terry McLaurin, who we'll mention in just a moment, to be an automatic play. I think this is going to be a fantastic matchup between these two teams, which should absolutely lead to fantasy points for Brian Robinson. Now, speaking of these two teams, let's talk about the New York Giants, specifically in the case of Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones going into this week is relatively high ranked within the conversation of quarterbacks in terms of my quarterback rankings for a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Now, I want to go ahead and give you guys a little bit more context as to why I have found so much confidence in playing Daniel Jones, despite the fact that this is the fantasy playoffs. And if you don't win, you're going home. Now, when we look at weeks 10 through 14 for Daniel Jones, he has been averaging a 67.5% passing completion percentage, 227 passing yards per game, 1.2 passing touchdowns per game, 0.4 interceptions, 6 rushing attempts, 37 rushing yards, and 0.4 rushing touchdowns per game, all for a 18.78 fantasy point per game average. Now, when you go ahead and isolate the rushing statistics that Daniel Jones has put forth, he's averaging about 6.1 fantasy points per game on average over the last 5 games in terms of, rushing yards and touchdowns accumulating for his performances. That's pretty good numbers. That's pretty much a rushing touchdowns worth of fantasy points every single week contributed to his scoreline, which he certainly needs considering he's not one of the more flashier passing quarterbacks, but he can get the job done. And specifically talking about getting the job done, he was able to do that just a couple weeks back against the Washington Commanders. In week 13, 25 for 31 passing. It's an 81% passing completion percentage, 200 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 0 interceptions, 12 rushing attempts for 71 rushing yards, 17.1 fantasy points. Now, when you look at the last couple games that he has put forth in terms of fantasy production, 18.28, 24.64, 17.1, 19.36, and 14.52. The lowest production, 14 fantasy points, came in the game against the Dallas Cowboys, where 4 of his offensive linemen were out on a short week on Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. Outside of that performance, everything has been 17 or more fantasy points thus far over the course of the last 5 games. I have a lot of trust that Daniel Jones is going to be able to deliver to us. I know that the weekend's matchup against Washington is going to be a pretty cold weather game. It's going to have some wind. It's not going to be raining. It's not going to be snowing, and it's going to be clear skies. And with that expectation, we should see a pretty good game out of Daniel Jones going into this upcoming weekend. Now, one of the final things I wanted to mention in regards to Daniel Jones before we move on to talking about some other must-start players going into week 15 is the fact that Richie James Jr. has cleared concussion protocol. The fact that you have Richie James, of course, Darius Slayton, and Isaiah Hodgins all out there. Pretty good production. Again, Richie James scored a touchdown in 3 out of the last 4 games. Isaiah Hodgins has scored a touchdown in the last 2 consecutive games. And the last time that Darius Slayton took on the Washington Commanders defense, 6 catches for 90 receiving yards. There is a lot of potential upside within this upcoming weekend's matchup. And I think that with all of his pieces ready to go, Daniel Jones will be at an even better capacity to score fantasy points for our fantasy teams. All right, let's go ahead and let's transition now into talking about some prize pick entries and specific must-start players going into the week, as I'll give you some context as to why I'm going ahead and putting these entries via PrizePicks as we approach Sunday of week 15. Let's get into it. Now, as you can see to the right of me, we are here via PrizePicks again. For those of you who are trying to check them out, you can go ahead, click the link down in the description, or go ahead and download the app via iOS, Android, all that kind of jazz. You can go ahead and use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first-time deposit, because your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Do not forget, again, like I mentioned before, the 12 Days of Pickmas is the current promotion going on. You can go ahead and take advantage of that. In regards to today's festive Flex Friday, that's a lot of Fs, but either way, whether it's this promotion and or the future upcoming 12 Days of Pickmas, you can go ahead and take advantage of it. This is only day 3, so you got a lot of opportunity ahead with the next 9 days coming your way. Be sure to use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about some potential entries and or must-start players going into the given week. Again, we want to go ahead and begin by talking about the upside of our must-start players, like I've mentioned before, there's a lot of statistics to go after, whether it's passing yards, rushing yards, receiving yards, receptions, all the combination of touchdowns, completions, interceptions, rushing attempts, sacks. You can go ahead, pick a bunch of different players, picking more or less on their given player statistics in order to determine whether your entry is a success and or a potential failure. I mean, we're again just predicting fantasy football. That's what we love to do. That's why we play it. If we could predict correctly, then we're in a good spot. So let's talk about the must-start players going into week 15. Some of the guys that I just mentioned and putting them in a potential entry. Now, one of the names we just mentioned was Daniel Jones. At this current moment in time, I 100% want to go ahead and take more on his given number of 18.5 total passing attempts. As of late, yes, he hasn't been able to accomplish it just this most recent week against the Philadelphia Eagles, but quite frankly, it wasn't a game where he was that far off. 18 total completions within said contest. I'm expecting this game to look a lot similar to the last time he took on the Washington Commanders. 25 for 31 passing and 81% passing completion percentage. We'll go ahead and pick more on that given player statistic. Moving on to the next one. We have Brian Robinson with 66.5 rushing yards. Again, like I've mentioned, in terms of his effectiveness over the course of the last 4 weeks now, he's continuing to get more and more opportunity. I'm expecting the matchup to be his best friend going up against the New York Giants, absolutely picking more on this given player statistic. Moving on to the last one, which is Travis Etienne. Now, the current number that I want to pick more on in regards to Travis Etienne is 60.5 rushing yards. Like I mentioned, the last couple weeks have been brutal. 30 rushing attempts for 86 rushing yards is definitely tough. But you were taking on the Detroit Lions and, of course, the Tennessee Titans. The Dallas Cowboys are neither of those teams. Like I mentioned, in the last 7 games that the Dallas Cowboys have played, they have allowed a minimum of 72 rushing yards to at least one running back in each of those contests. I'm expecting Travis Etienne to easily surpass this number of 60.5. So when we go ahead and pick more on all 3 of these given player statistics, you can go ahead and potentially make this a flex play where if you get 2 out of the 3 right, you can still get your potential entry back with a little bit on top of it. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to make this a power play and try to 5 times our overall entry right now. Now, when we continue on, I want to talk about kickers because, again, I don't really talk about kickers very often throughout the course of a week. I mentioned a couple players in terms of waiver wire, but by the time I even get to Friday, the weather concerns and all that kind of jazz certainly do make an effect as to whether or not I'm playing said players. So let's talk about some must-start kickers going into week 15. I wanted to go ahead and, because we're in December, already just give you guys the idea that I'm going to be talking about 2 players that are playing indoors this weekend. The first one being Chase McLaughlin, who over the course of the last couple of weeks has demonstrated very easily that he can surpass this number of 1.5 field goals made. In terms of fantasy production, especially for those of you who get 4 points for a 40-yard field goal, 40 to 49 yards, or 5 points for anything more than 50 yards, he certainly can be a serviceable, overall kicker within this given week and get you 10 points when it's all said and done, especially considering the advantageous matchup going up against the Minnesota Vikings defense, who give up their fair share of points. So Chase McLaughlin is the first one that I wanted to talk about. The other one is Younghoe Koo. Younghoe Koo, over the course of the last couple weeks, certainly been able to put the ball through the uprights, with Desmond Ridder becoming the starting quarterback of this team, with Marcus Mariota knee surgery going to the injured reserve. This presents even more opportunity for this offense to stagnate at times down the field, to allow him indoors to go ahead, put it through the uprights, and with no other conditions besides just him being a stud kicker and delivering fantasy points and or a great entry for this upcoming week. So we're going to go ahead, put these 2 players in a given entry. We're just going to call this the kicker entry. Put it together, go into this weekend with a nice power play here, enter this, and move to the next one. Now, one of the final entries I want to make going into this week is a little bit of a redemption play from last week. Again, some of the players like a Justin Herbert, Derrick Henry, Ezekiel Elliott were all in combination there. It just didn't pan out because there were just way too many legs. So let's go ahead, let's minimize that. And let's talk about this upcoming week's entry that I have the utmost confidence in right now. First and foremost, let's talk about rushing touchdowns. Derrick Henry's an automatic. That is going for more than 0.5 rushing touchdowns. I'm expecting that. Let's talk about more touchdowns. Hey, Ezekiel Elliott, you've scored a touchdown in 6 consecutive games. Fantastic. Let's go ahead. Let's pick more on that given number. The next player I want to talk about is Justin Herbert. Now, even though last week I wasn't able to take advantage of his 0.5 passing yards and bring in an awesome overall play, I think Justin Herbert, the fact that he's been throwing the ball as much as he has over the last couple weeks here, 320 plus yards in each of the last 2 games, and now he has to take on the Tennessee Titans defense that quite literally gives up the fewest rushing yards per game on average and fewest yards per carry to opposing running backs over the course of the last 2 months. This makes him an automatic play to go over 300 passing yards. I'm obviously taking that on the more. Another player that I really like in terms of overall receiving yards has to do with Terry McLaurin. I've mentioned this in the past and I'll continue to mention it. Terry McLaurin, in his entire career up against the New York Giants, has never had a singular game of less than 70 receiving yards. That is a fact. You can go ahead and stat check me. I've done my research, trust me. This upcoming week, I have him as a top 10 wide receiver going into the week. My goodness, I've been scrolling for for how long now, and I can't find Terry McLaurin. There he is. They have him at 58.5. This is an automatic. In the last 2 games that he's taken on the Washington Commanders, he has surpassed over 100 receiving yards in both those games, over 8 catches in both those games, and a receiving touchdown in both those games. Both those contests with Taylor Heineke. Just putting it in perspective, with Adoree Jackson out, this is probably my favorite play of the entire week. Picking more on this given player statistic. Now, I don't want to go too crazy here, but I honestly feel really confident about the potential here of Zeke falling to the end zone, Henry falling into the end zone, of course, someone like Justin Herbert throwing for over 300 yards, and getting Terry McLaurin back into that conversation. Therefore, we'll go ahead, put this entry, try to 10 times our overall entry going into the given week. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to click the like button down below. Let me know down in the comment section if you have any questions. Again, tomorrow, if you guys have any questions, you can stop on by from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be live streaming here on the channel. I'll also be live streaming from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on Sunday morning. Kick off with Kirchhoff, as we'll have updated rankings on screen for our top 36 running backs, wide receivers, top 16 quarterbacks, and tight ends for the remainder of Week 15 in order to help you set your lineups and help you continue to get you closer to your goal of winning a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.